Today we're going to take a trip way back, about 10,000 years into the past. We're going to uncover how a single, simple invention really designed the world that you and I live in today. It's a story about power, about society, and believe it or not, about the very words on this screen.
But let's start with a question that feels very modern, something that probably bugs all of us at some point. Why do we pay taxes? I mean, really, why do governments even exist in the first place? It's a question that shapes our jobs, our money, our entire relationship with the state.
Now you might think the answer has to do with kings, or constitutions, or some kind of grand social contract. But the real, original root of all that power? It's not found in a throne room. It's not in a government building.
The answer is actually much more down to earth. Literally, it's written in the soil, in a simple furrow that was cut into the ground thousands and thousands of years ago. The entire architecture of our civilization, including the government's power to tax you, it all starts right here.
Yep, it all starts with the plow. I know what you might be thinking, a farming tool? But this simple device is so much more than that. It's the blueprint for everything that came after it. Cities, writing, laws, even the complex social structures that define our lives today.
So here's how we're going to trace this incredible story. We'll start with the plow's ancient origins. Then we'll see how it let us harness a whole new kind of power and how that created the very first taxable harvest. From there, we'll see how society was completely rewritten, what the environmental cost of all this was, and finally, how the plow's long shadow still touches all of our lives today.
So to really get a handle on its impact, we first have to understand where this deceptively simple, world-changing tool even came from.
For millennia, farming was just backbreaking work with digging sticks and hoes. But then, around 4000 BCE in Mesopotamia, something new appears, the ard. It was basically a digging stick pulled by an animal. A simple idea, but a game changer. 1,000 years later, the Sumerians had a brilliant idea. They attached a funnel to it to drop seeds right into the furrow, the cedar plow. The Romans made it tougher by adding an iron tip. And by the Middle Ages, you had the heavy moldboard plow, which could finally turn over the thick, wet soils of Northern Europe. It's an incredible evolution, from a simple piece of wood to John Deere's steel plow. It's the story of humanity figuring out how to master the earth itself.
But you see, the evolution of the tool itself is really only half the story. The true revolution was how it completely changed our whole concept of energy and work. This wasn't just a slightly better way to farm, this was a fundamental shift in the entire human energy system.
Just look at this contrast. It's dramatic. Before the plow, the only power source available was human muscle. A family's wealth was directly tied to how many people they had to work the fields. But the plow, pulled by oxen, changed everything. It externalized that energy. And all of a sudden, the biggest limit on your success wasn't just labor anymore, it was capital. Could you afford the oxen? Could you get a plow? This is the moment that the world's very first agricultural surplus becomes possible.
And the scale of this change, it is just staggering. We're talking about a single farmer with a team of oxen being able to cultivate up to 10 times more land than someone with a hoe. That's an efficiency leap that's almost hard for us to wrap our heads around. A productivity explosion that would literally echo for thousands of years.
You have to think of it this way. The ox-drawn plow was the robotics of its time. Seriously, for the very first time in all of human history, wealth was separated from physical labor. A person's prosperity was no longer limited by how hard they could personally work, but by their access to this new technology. And that right there, that set the stage for deep, structural inequality that just wasn't possible before.
So we've got this new agricultural surplus. But it wasn't just about food, it was about creating something entirely new. Concentrated power. For the first time, there was an abundance that could be controlled, stored, and, maybe most importantly, taken.
So why did early states pop up in some farming societies, but not others? Well, the answer seems to be in this fascinating idea called appropriability theory. It basically argues that for a state to form, you didn't just need a surplus of food. You needed a surplus that was easy to tax. The crucial factor wasn't just how much food you had, but what kind of food it was.
And it all comes down to the crops themselves. Cereal grains like wheat and barley, the very crops the plow made it possible to grow at a massive scale, were perfect for a tax collector. They all ripen at the same time, they're visible above ground, and you can store them for years in a granary. The taxman knew exactly when to show up and where to collect. But now compare that to root crops like yams. You can leave those in the ground and just harvest them whenever you need them. They're invisible, they're perishable, and they're almost impossible for some central government to systematically tax.
And this is the whole point, right? As these researchers put it,
Hierarchy really took off because we became dependent on these specific, appropriable grains. So the plow didn't just create food, it created a very specific kind of wealth, one that was visible, storable, and taxable. And that predictable surplus of grain became the financial foundation for the world's first states. It's a simple formula. No grain, no granary. No granary, no taxman. And no taxman, no state.
Okay, so now we have a steady, taxable food supply, and we have a central authority to manage it. What happens next? Well, the entire structure of human society begins to transform in ways that are both profound and permanent.
This plow-driven surplus kicked off a chain reaction, like a series of dominoes falling. With more food than people needed just to get by, populations could grow, and that new density led to the world's first cities. And for the very first time in history, a huge chunk of the population didn't have to farm at all. This surplus fed a whole new class of people. Priests who managed the food stores, soldiers who protected them, and all the artisans, merchants, and bureaucrats who ran the whole system.
And think about this. How on earth do you manage all of this grain, all these taxes, all these people? You need to keep records. The world's first writing system, cuneiform, wasn't invented to write poetry or great stories. It was invented for accounting. It was a tool for bureaucrats to track bushels of barley, to record who owed what, and to manage the complex logistics of the world's very first agricultural state. And this connection between plowing and writing is so deep, it's literally baked into our language. One of the earliest ways of writing is called boustrophedon, and what it means is that the lines of text go back and forth across the page, just like an ox plowing a field. The word itself literally means as the ox turns. The physical act of farming actually gave us the mental model for how to organize our thoughts on a page. It's incredible.
But there's always a but, isn't there? This brand new blueprint for civilization, built on intensive plow agriculture, it had a critical flaw. Forcing the land to produce these massive surpluses year after year after year, well, it came at a very steep environmental price. A perfect way to see this is to compare the world's first two plow-based civilizations, Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt. In Mesopotamia, they relied on this really complex network of canals to irrigate their fields. But in that dry climate, the water would evaporate and leave behind mineral salts. Over centuries, that salt just built up and up, poisoning the soil. They literally farmed themselves into collapse. Egypt, on the other hand, had the Nile's predictable annual flood. That flood didn't just drop off a fresh layer of fertile silt every year, it also washed away all the accumulated salts. Their system was just vastly more sustainable, and it's a big reason why their civilization lasted for 3,000 years.
So as we start to wrap this up, you can really see the two sides of this simple tool's legacy. The plow was this incredible creative force, but it was also a destructive one, and its impact is still deeply embedded in the world we live in today. The plow was the architect of our modern world, no question. It created the surpluses that built our cities and states. It gave us a reason to invent writing. But at the same time, it engineered deep social and economic inequality by making capital, not just your own hard work, the key to wealth. And as we just saw, it gave humanity the power to create environmental disasters on a scale that was never, ever imagined before.
You know, that simple plow set in motion a chain of events that defined 10,000 years of human history. Its unintended consequences, everything from taxes to inequality to ecological collapse, shaped entire civilizations. And it leaves us with a pretty vital question to think about. What are the long shadows of our own technologies? What unforeseen social and environmental blueprints are being written right now, today, by our digital tools, by our AI, and by our own relentless drive for a surplus?